Hi everyone, this is Andy here from Simon Fraser University. As part of the energy policy course, I want to talk to you today about climate change, and particularly what climate change is, what solutions we have for it, and why we don't seem to be acting fast enough on it. As you know, climate change is an impending disaster. Doesn't seem that we can go through a day or a week without hearing about some kind of wildfire or flood, and yet we don't seem to be doing too much about it. Why is that? Well, we're going to start off the lecture talking about the evidence for climate change, the effects of climate change. May seem hard to believe to some of you, but some people are still doubtful about climate change and don't understand its real effects that will touch every person on the planet and will touch every economic sector and will choke off our ability to have thriving economies. We'll talk about sources of climate change and the importance of the human perspective. The human perspective will take us to the policy solutions that have been offered for climate change and why they don't seem to really be sticking in many countries. So let's start without spending too much time on the scientific evidence for climate change. And I want to thank the IPCC for offering these really important slides. You can check out the IPCC website, and it has all the latest scientific information about climate change. You can see in this top left-hand corner how much temperature has increased since the 1950s. And you can see our reported temperatures from the 1850s. There have always been cycles, but there's an unmistakable upward trend in these. And that upward trend is clearly related to increases in fossil fuels and the burning of them leading to CO2, methane, and to a lesser extent, nitrous oxide. Methane is a big byproduct of natural gas, and it has a much more deleterious short-term effect on climate change than does carbon dioxide. But both are extremely dangerous and concerning. The IPCC also tells us that we should call it climate change because there will be varying effects across different parts of the world. And in general, the globe will warm, but the amount of precipitation and the types of patterns and currents that we have around precipitation will vary from one place to the other. The bottom line is, the hotter it gets, the worse these effects are going to be. We'll see increasing flooding. We'll see the inundation of coastal cities, including Vancouver, with sea level rise. We'll see the accelerating decline in biodiversity and collapse of ecosystems, the hotter it gets. So the sooner we act, the better. Where are a lot of our emissions coming on a global level? They're coming across the board. A lot of it is coming from electricity and heat production. And this should be surprising to some of us because we have ready solutions in terms of wind and solar prices coming down about 90% in the last 3 decades. We have solutions for transportation in the form of electric vehicles. Hopefully in the next decade, we'll start to impose those. One thing that's overlooked is how important some of these other sectors are for climate change, including agriculture. When you just think about agriculture and the way that food is moved around from one place to the other on the globe, a lot of that is tied to fossil fuels, as are fertilizers, as are tractors. Let's talk about where climate change is happening in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. And what you can see is the unmistakable increase in emissions rising from China. To a lesser extent, that's also true in India. Now, historically, the West has been the one responsible for climate change emissions, and so we should burden the largest part of climate change adaptation and mitigation expenses. But the good news is that the emissions have started to decline in both the US and in Europe. In Canada, they've largely plateaued, so we're certainly not doing our part here. If you start to add together some of the larger oil producers and fast-growing developing economies like Indonesia, what we see is they've added together they become a very significant source of climate change. So we can't just think about green transitions in one part of the world, but it has to happen everywhere. Let's think about our system and policy perspective. Now, what we've seen is that climate change is related across the board to every economic sector. And in the same way, it has to be viewed as affecting every part of our overall ecosystem that we call Earth. It affects precipitation. It affects methane releases from the oceans, ocean acidification. It will affect fishing. It will affect food security. It will affect human health. And it will affect all ecosystems across the planet, not just in the Arctic. And in fact, the IPCC has started to lay out some of these effects that will most unduly and negatively impact our quality of life. The decreasing water availability in North America and Europe is likely to happen. We've already seen droughts in parts of the American West, for example. We've seen wildfires because of the dry heat that has been occurring with increasing temperatures in the summer, both in Europe and in North America. We see an increasing possibility of the collapse of ecosystems, including corals being bleached and all the ecosystems that come from them. We see the potential for the collapse of our main breadbasket areas, creating food insecurity. We will see flooding from coastal city, and remember, most of our population is living in our large coastal cities. These are huge amounts of money and damage that have already started to happen. And then we will see an increase in disease vectors as temperatures start to rise. And in a human way, we should add the likelihood of climate refugees and migrations that are already occurring from North Africa and from Latin America to the north. So we have to think then about climate change as not just a problem of geography and environmental systems, but we have to think of them as closely tied to human systems. It's human systems that created climate change through these emissions, and it's only human systems that can start to tackle them. We have to think about changing the way that we produce things, and that in turn requires changes in our policies to start thinking about the long term and not just think about the next 6 months. So what we've talked about in terms of climate change evidence is that there is almost indisputable evidence that climate change is happening, that's going to affect a variety of economic sectors, and it will in fact affect the ability of us to harvest nature. We rely so much on nature that we take for granted, from our food to our air to our water. And we were taking all those systems for granted. They will certainly deteriorate. We had a modicum of hope in the Paris Agreement a few years ago, but what we see is that, in fact, there's been a retrenchment of promises, particularly by the United States and to some degree by other countries in terms of their climate change pledges. So certainly those international agreements have not been near enough. What have been some of the solutions on a domestic level? Well, some engineers hope that there will be a technological breakthrough. In Canada, we tried a carbon tax. In the EU, they've tried cap and trade, that is setting a ceiling on emissions. In the US, they tried renewable portfolio standards. There have been efforts around carbon trading in terms of trading for the ability to create pollution. And some consumers have decided to make choices like buying EVs to express their concern about climate change, but market solutions alone have not nearly been enough. As we see, in fact, the temperatures continue to rise year after year. So in terms of finding a silver bullet that will change the market conditions to make electric vehicles more acceptable, we've seen partly a movement in that direction in terms of natural gas displacing coal, and in fact solar and wind have come down drastically, but the challenge so far is that we've had a century of investment into fossil fuels. We continue to subsidize and support fossil fuels, and batteries tend to be expensive and also create a limited range. That's put a damper on electric vehicles and also slowed the progress of changing out our electricity systems from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And then finally, the last tool in our toolbox would be regulatory solutions. This would be going beyond the carbon tax, which was rolled back recently in Canada, towards new standards for carbon emissions, towards heavy investment in clean energy infrastructure. In Germany, for example, they instituted feed-in tariffs, which gave a subsidy to solar and renewable energy producers. It led to widespread adoption of them, but those have also been rolled back in the wake of economic crisis on the basis of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. The EU still tends to be the leader in general in terms of green energy, and in fact, it has proposed a carbon border tax, which would tax incoming imports on the basis of how much pollution they've created. So what are some of the reasons why there hasn't been adequate policy attention to climate change? Well, first of all, there is a challenge of trying to overcome decades of climate change denial. There are still loads of misinformation about climate change. Secondly, there is an unwillingness to recognize what we call market failures. That is, the cost of pollution passed on from fossil fuel industries towards everyone. And those real costs of fossil fuels have not been recognized by the governments. Thirdly, we have what we call the tragedy of the commons. That is, there are areas where we share resources such as the ocean, such as air, that create the problem of who is responsible for those areas. Without any clear property rights in areas or resources that we share, we need a global government to start to enforce things like the Paris Agreement. Yet the Paris Agreement depends on national willingness to abide by voluntary commitments. And so there's no real enforcement for global treaties. It really depends on nations to decide this. And then finally, what we see is that the costs of climate change are spread geographically, whereas the revenues for fossil fuels are concentrated, and the costs are going to be paid at a higher and higher level by future generations. No one is really advocating for them right now. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. Why are we so unwilling to pay for the cost of adjustment when we know that the costs of climate change are increasing all the time? We have a little bit of data now about this, and what we see is that most people do understand global warming. They understand, 59%, at least in the United States, understand that global warming has started to happen. They are concerned, at least a plurality are concerned about climate change, and they are willing to pay more for green energy. So it's a very curious thing. They are less willing to pay increases in gas taxes, but it still is a curious thing that there hasn't been really enough action on climate change. Lack of knowledge is certainly not the issue. There's a large partisan divide in the U.S. where Republican and conservative voters tend to be more skeptical about climate. In fact, we can't think about them just along two-party lines, but there are multiple groups, probably close to a fifth of which are skeptical. Another fifth are quite concerned. And then we have a large percentage that are in between those two. And it's that large percentage in between that we need to reach. The UK is not too different. In a recent study by them, most believe that it's occurring, but they view it as of low salience or importance. And not surprisingly, for lower income and older groups, they are more skeptical about immediate climate action. And even though the EU is in the forefront, there is still resistance to paying higher prices though in the end we're paying much higher prices by supporting fossil fuels through all the costs of pollution and the chaos that those will create. So to sum up what we know about why things haven't happened yet in terms of climate change, we have decades of denial and continuing misinformation led by politicians, including Trump. We have a challenge to sell the problem of climate change to the public. The IPCC is largely been ineffective in reaching the layperson. If you look at their website, you'll understand why. It's written for a scientist. It's not written for the general public. And so as a result, there's no immediate sense of crisis about climate change. There's an immediate sense of crisis about US tariffs and about Russian invasions, but not about climate change. So it's the slow boil that is going to cook us because it's not immediately in front of us. And we are too myopic to consider the long-term effects of climate change at this point, though the increasing disasters might change that. In fact, we have improvements in technology. While fossil fuels were largely responsible for the wealth of the 20th century, the technology for renewable energies is improving very fast to the point where solar and wind are competitive with natural gas. And certainly coal is far more expensive and nuclear is far more expensive. But what we don't have is a system to consider the cost of externalities of pollution. And so fossil fuels producers, they seem like they're cheaper, but in fact the costs to society are far, far greater. The bottom line is we've had more than a century of investment in fossil fuels, including every gas station, including utilities that rely on fossil fuels, including pipelines. And we really need major investment push by the government to overcome that carbon lock-in. People are also wary about supporting local renewable energy. They're concerned about, because of misinformation about windmills, about solar farms, and they think that this is a nuisance. And yet they ignore all the effects that fossil fuels have had on their health and on the health of the planet. And so what we have then is a system that is drowning in short-term concentration, ignoring the possibility to create new jobs through a green transition. And Canada is no different. We've had a rhetorical commitment to dealing with climate change, but even the latest government continues to support fossil fuels. Why is Europe farther ahead? I think it's an interesting question that we should consider. First of all, there's no significant oil and gas industry outside of Norway. That means there's not a big fossil fuels lobby in the continent. There's proportional representation, which has allowed green parties, particularly in Germany and in some other countries, to actually have a chance to sway policy. The Chernobyl nuclear accident really raised awareness, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine raised awareness about the vulnerabilities of the EU energy system. And the EU has recognized through industrial policy the possibility to create jobs through the green revolution. So climate change is undeniable in Canada. We've had a whole town burned down. We've had increasing wildfires. We have atmospheric river events and heat domes, and will certainly affect our quality of life. In fact, we have plateaued in terms of our emissions. About a third of our emissions are coming from oil and gas, and they are not decreasing. And BC's emission target is nowhere close to where we are in terms of emissions. So I would ask you to take a few minutes and discuss the problem. Why aren't we acting faster? How can we fight against the oil and gas lobbies? How can we make the Green Party a more important voice in terms of our political decision-making? How do we get people to recognize the consequences, the disastrous consequences that will happen in 10 years if we don't act now? Are we really willing to sacrifice a bit of a boost of cheaper gas prices in order to have a scorched earth 10 years from now? That doesn't seem like a good trade-off if you actually think about it. But our politics are reflecting public sentiment, and the public so far is not willing to support active climate policy. And lastly, I would like to leave you with one interesting thought. How is it that we arrived at a solution to the pandemic within a year, an all hands on deck approach? And yet with climate change, which will be so much more devastating, has been already, we are acting as if it's out of sight, out of mind. Some things to ponder, and hopefully the lecture started to give you some ideas about the nature of these problems and how we might start to solve them. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.